lecture. For some of you who do not know about our center, McClure Center for Faith and Science, it is a place that has been established for our students to reconcile what they can touch and feel and see and measure and experience with their senses, reconcile that with what we believe to be true about our God. And it would not be possible if it were not for the generosity of Dr. Robert and Mrs. Brenda McClure, who are with us tonight. So thank you very much. We have experienced a 2-year hiatus in our spring McClure lecture. We're really excited to have it restart this year. The McClures not only have funded our center, but they have funded a professorship. And so I get to introduce to you Dr. John Lewis, who is the McClure Professor of Faith and Science. John is responsible for leading the center and is responsible for carrying out this great work of helping our students reconcile science with faith. His training is from Texas A&M University. He's an ecologist and a wildlife biologist, and he will introduce the name.
Well, thank you all for coming. I would also like to extend my thanks to the McClures who make my position possible. So a couple of things that we're doing in the center. One is at Lipscomb we have breakout chapels on Thursdays. So this position has allowed me time to spend some more time thinking about breakout chapels. Dr. Ellis, who's with us today, has been helping with that, and Dr. Lawrence, Dr. Mayo, so several of the faculty. And that's really part of what we want to do with the McClure Center is develop interdisciplinary relationships across campus among the faculty, as well as the relationships between faculty and students. As students learn science and the rest of the liberal arts curriculum, and then try to integrate that with their faith. And so that's our main push. This lectureship series is another key component of that, and we have lots of other things planned for the future, so we're excited to see where that goes. So with that, I'd like to bring up Dean David Holmes. Dean Holmes is formerly from Pepperdine, and so is good friends with our speaker, and I'll give him the honor of introducing Dr. Ed Larson to us tonight.
Before we had fancy words like cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary, there was just intellectual curiosity. We see that intellectual curiosity in the likes of someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who, while he was a portrait artist, was very interested in anatomy and in engineering, and you saw in him this curiosity for how things work and how ideas merge together. I could say that even though he would not at all compare himself to Da Vinci, our speaker is an extremely curious man. I would also say that, with probably a great deal more confidence, he falls within the tradition of what we would call public intellectuals. Those who do scholarly work for sure, but those who also feel that their thoughts need to be communicated to a wider public, even a non-academic public. Dr. Ed Larson is the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law and University Professor of History at Pepperdine University. In case you missed that, that means he has an honored academic position in 2 spaces, law and history. He is the author or co-author of 14 books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Summer of the Gods, The Scopes Trial in America's Continuing Debate over Science and Religion. But to speak to the broader audience, Larson has articles that have appeared in Nature, Atlantic Monthly, Time, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. An insatiable curiosity and a desire to communicate the historical context and the scientific facts that come from the consideration of both. I am pleased to call him a friend, a real friend who will tell you things you need to hear and things you may not want to hear, but at the same time, be an affirming individual. We are very fortunate to have him here. He has already interacted with our students, and I think he will do so again Dr. Lewis tomorrow. And so please join me in welcoming a very distinguished person and a very dear friend, Dr. Ed Larson.
You guys are so lucky to have him as your dean. Oh, you didn't, can you people hear me okay? Because nobody, yeah, good, you can all hear me? I'll just speak up. Good, I didn't get wired up. It is great to be here, and already I have new friends. John, what you're running here, and McClure's, the program you built here, and the tour your husband gave me this afternoon, what kindness and generosity. As I meet more and more people here, I see that this is a very special place. I've spoken now at, I think this will complete the run of Church of Christ schools for me, because I haven't been here before. I don't know what you call the other one in Memphis here. Is that Church of Christ technically? Belmont, right? No? They claim they were when they got me to speak. But I think this is just going to be, and I really enjoy being here, and I'm looking forward to meeting more of your students tomorrow. Now, when they talked about what I wanted to speak in, I gave various options, but it settled on a little Tennessee story. To round out a Tennessee story from a book that I wrote, over 20 years ago, on the Scopes trial. And I don't know if it's the perfect story to tell on a Holy Week that we're in. I don't think it has, it's not a very holy story, but it'll be a very different story than the legend. So I was speaking on the Scopes trial and history and folklore, and if you don't understand those two pictures, and you will by the end of the talk, the folklore part is from the movie Inherit the Wind. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie or the play. A lot of people should still put it on in high schools. And that's the Scopes from that movie, who later played in Bewitched, of course. And on the other side, that's the actual, that's not Harold Lloyd, that's the actual John Scopes. And this is a little Tennessee story for you. Now, it may be the most famous scene in the legendary encounter between science and religion to occur in American history or in American folklore. A delegation of townspeople, stirred by the preaching of a Reverend Jeremiah Brown, whose name evokes images of the fanaticism of the biblical Jeremiah and of the abolitionist John Brown, takes a young science teacher from his classroom and throws him in jail for teaching his students about the Darwinian theory of human evolution. Such teaching supposedly undermines their faith in the biblical account of creation. Now, American viewers of the scene, they're watching the movie or watching the play, presumably know that the teacher in this historic encounter is John Scopes, and that it occurred during the summer of 1925, almost 100 years ago, and they're having me back to Dayton for the 100th anniversary. So if you want, we're planning big festivities down in Dayton for the summer of 2025. I'd be happy to see you again down there. Though I recommend staying in Chattanooga. Too often. Well, in the best known retelling of this episode, which appears in the during 1955 play, which at the time was the longest running play in Broadway history, and still plays in various senior class plays and high school plays around the country. And the 1970 movie, and if you want me sometime get me going, I'll tell you a story of why it came out in 1960. 1960 movie, Inherit the Wind, with Spencer Tracy and Henry Morgan and a whole variety, Gene Kelly and a whole variety of others. The main characters in both episodes, except for Jeremiah Brown and Scopes' fiancée, who had no parallels whatsoever in Dayton. Scopes didn't have a fiancée, and there was no fundamentalist minister like Brown living in Dayton at that time. The other characters are given sounded-alike pseudonyms for their real names, and the time, if you read the script of the play, the beginning, the time is set as, quote, summer not too long ago. The movie version opens with town officials going into the classroom. Right from that picture, you see Scopes allegedly teaching, and that was the chart in the movie. Town officials, led by Brown, hauling Scopes out of the classroom for teaching evolution. According to the script, for innocently doing his job, Scopes is threatened with fine and imprisonment. Now, it makes for powerful drama, a scene seared in the national consciousness, but it never happened that way at all. The trial was not a witch hunt led by a fundamentalist firebrand, but a bizarre publicity stunt concocted by secular civic leaders. Earlier in 1925, the Tennessee State Legislature, meeting here in Nashville, had passed a statute making it a misdemeanor, punishable by a maximum fine of $500, the exact same fine as for a liquor violation back then, for a public school teacher, and I'm quoting, to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man, as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man had descended from a lower order of animals. Nothing about other types of evolution, just about human evolution. And it was signed by Governor Austin Peay in a deal. He didn't like the bill, but he got state funding for high school education throughout Tennessee in return for signing this bill. Now, upon learning of this restriction, the New York-based American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, Bennett didn't have local chapters. You have a local chapter right here in Nashville. Didn't have local chapters in, it only had a New York chapter. From New York, it issued a press release offering to assist any teacher willing to challenge the constitutionality of the new law in court. If you're a lawyer, they were envisioning a declaratory judgment action. John Scopes became that willing client at the invitation of Dayton school leaders. Well, think about it. If not occurring like in the movie or in the play, as some sort of a local witch hunt stirred up by, who's clearly portrayed as a local demagogue. If it's not that, why Dayton? Why did this happen? Why Dayton of all places? Well, that's what they asked at the time. Because there is Scopes, there is the movie Inherit the Wind, and the main characters, Spencer Tracy, Frederick Marsh. That's what the paper asked. Why Dayton? That's a picture from, there's a lot of pictures. There's a lot of news reporters were there. Why Dayton of all places? Well, it was then, and it is now. If you go there now, it hasn't changed all that much. It was a small East Tennessee hill town, situated midway between Knoxville and Chattanooga in the valley carved by the Tennessee River and the rising foothills of East Tennessee. Dayton, at the time, lacked both a sense of tradition and confidence in the future. The town sprang up in the late 19th centuries with the coming of the railroads and became the commercial and governmental center of Ray County. It hadn't even existed in 1870. It was part of the so-called New South. Northern money financed laying the rail lines, digging the nearby iron mines, and building a blast furnace that attracted hundreds of Scottish immigrants and underemployed Southerners to good jobs in the new town. But the local economy had faltered when the blast furnace closed early in the new century, and concerned civic leaders actively courted new industry as they watched their town's population fall from a high of about 3,000 during the 1890s to fewer than 1,800 by the time of the Scopes trial, 30 years later. There, this fellow, George Rapplier, a New Yorker with some training in civil engineering, managed the largely dormant local coal and iron facilities for their northern owners. He was only 31 years at the time. Rapplier had drifted away from his childhood Catholicism while in college and had written letters to the Chattanooga Times opposing the enactment of Tennessee's anti-evolution law. Upon reading in that newspaper, then it passed anyway, and upon reading in that newspaper, the Chattanooga Times, on May 4th, about the ACLU offer to defend to any teacher willing to defend, to attack or challenge the statute in court, he got to thinking, and he set about drawing others into his scheme. Here was a chance to try to strike the statute, and he could draw others in by appealing to their universal interest, their own economic self-interest, not any sort of religious purpose, because they knew he wasn't motivated by a religious purpose, except to strike the statute. The others were mostly didn't care one way or the other. So what happened? Well, Rapplier hurried down to the local drugstore. There it is, picture taken during the trial. See the sign, Robinson's Drugstore, where it all started. This was all in that sign. Hurried down to Frank Robinson's Drugstore with a newspaper in hand. Robinson chaired the Ray County School Board, and the soda fountain in his downtown drugstore served as the watering hole for the town's local business, professional, and legal elite during those days of national prohibition. Mr. Robinson, you always looking for something that will get Dayton a little publicity. I wonder if you'd seen the morning paper. Robinson later recalled Rapplier asking. Of course, Robinson had seen the morning paper, the normal morning Chattanooga paper, but he hadn't noticed anything about the ACLU offer. It didn't stand out. And then Rapplier began relating his scheme of staging a test case for the new law in Dayton. It would get national attention. It would get tourists. It would get jobs. Well, at least it would get customers for your local drugstore. And then these drugstore conspirators, the head of the school board, the local principal, the superintendent of schools, one or two local lawyers, summoned the town's, the high school's 24-year-old, oh, there's the drugstore, there's the reenacted, it's now in a museum there in town. It works. They called down Lipscomb. They called down the school's 24-year-old, first-year general science instructor and part-time football coach, John Scopes. Robinson offered me a chair, and the boy who worked as a soda jerk brought me a fountain drink. Scopes later wrote, "John, we've been arguing," said Rapplier, "and I said that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution." "That's right," I said, not sure what he was leading up to. Scopes then pulled down a copy of a biology textbook from the sales shelves in the store, because conveniently the enterprising Robinson, as a school board chair, also sold public school textbooks. Back then you didn't get them from the state, you had to buy them. And Scopes opened it to the section on human evolution. This was a state-approved textbook, prescribed for use in all Tennessee high schools, and it was purely evolutionary. "You've been teaching them from this book?" Rapplier said. "Yes," I said. I explained that I had used it briefly while filling in for the principal during his illness. He was the regular biology teacher. Scopes recalled saying, "Then you've been violating the law," Robinson said. The school board chair then told Scopes about the ACLU offer and asked him, invited him, would you stand for the case? Would you let your name be used? Would you stand trial? And thinking about it, Scopes volunteered. Now he represented an ideal defendant for the test case. Single, easygoing, without any fixed intention of staying in Dayton. He was from Kentucky. He had little to lose from a summertime caper. Unlike the regular biology teacher, who, as the school principal, had administrative duties and also a family, Scopes also looked the part of an earnest teacher, complete with horn-rimmed glasses and a boyish face that made him appear academic but not threatening. Naturally shy, cooperative, well-liked, he would not alienate parents or taxpayers with soapbox speeches on evolution or give the appearance of a radical and ungrateful public employee. Yet his friends knew that Scopes disapproved of the new law and accepted an evolutionary view of human origins. But he did all this in an easygoing way. Indeed, he liked to talk about sports much more than politics, and occasionally attended Dayton's more liberal, more progressive Methodist church as a way to, well, I don't know if it's politically correct, but as he put it, to pick up girls. This was the defendant, an establishment rebel who would test the law without causing any trouble. ACLU Chief Counsel Arthur Garfield Hayes later confided, had we sought to find a defendant to present this issue, we could not have approved on John Scopes. Well, despite Scopes' ideal casting for the play, for his role, it became a bit part, both in Inherit the Wind, if you watch that movie or see the play, and in the actual trial itself, and that part's authentic. In both the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, and the press assumed the leading roles. You can see them highlighted even in that screen. The people who were starring the person playing Clarence Darrow for the defense, Frederick Marsh, William James Bryan for the prosecution, and Gene Kelly representing H.L. Mencken for the media. Those were the names of ours. They stole the show. If you watch the movie, you'll hardly remember Scopes. You will remember them. Well, in Inherit the Wind, as presented there, Bryan, Frederick Marsh, appears almost out of thin air. The audience learns that, and I'm quoting from the script, learns that he was nominated for president 3 times, that he remained an influential political orator, and that he retained a fundamentalist faith in the Bible. Only at the end does Gene Kelly, playing H.L. Mencken, the journalist, explain, quote, something happens to an also-ran. He becomes a national, and that is why I'm getting off the train in Scopes. Something happens to an also-ran. He becomes a national unloved child. And unloved child of all ages insinuate themselves in the spotlights. But in this instance, if you look at the real event, the real-life Bryan did much more than insinuate himself into a spotlight. He actually lit up that spotlight by focusing national attention on the social implications of Darwinism, and wrote books and crusaded around the country to get these laws passed. Indeed, he came and spoke at a joint session of the Tennessee legislature to persuade them to enact the statute, which everyone then would have called Bryan's statute. Of course, Tennessee had voted for Bryan 3 times for president. He was a thief. Well, now, where does this all come from? Ever since Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in 1859, some conservative Christians objected to the atheistic implications of its naturalistic explanation for the origins of biological species, particularly humans. But remember, that was 60 years earlier. Early in the 20th century, these objections intensified with the spread of fundamentalism in reaction to some traditional American Protestant denominations leaning more toward increased liberalism, or called modernism at the time, within the mainline denominations, within the mainline Baptist, Northern Baptist, within the Episcopal, within the Methodist, within the Presbyterian denominations. Bryan, a political progressive with decidedly conservative religious beliefs, added his voice to the chorus following the First World War, as he came to see Darwinian struggle for survival thinking known as social Darwinism when applied to human society, behind excessive militarism, imperialism, and laissez-faire capitalism, the three deadly sins in Bryan's political theology. With his progressive political instincts of seeking a legislative solution to social problems, Bryan called for enactment of state restrictions against teaching of Darwinism, or the Darwinian theory of human evolution, in public schools. Indeed, he had all the trappings of a political campaign, as Bryan spoke, wrote, and lobbied for such laws across America, speaking in dozens of state legislatures, giving over a 2-year period literally hundreds, over 500 public addresses around the country, and publishing books, tracts, and articles. This is what led to Tennessee passing the law in 1925. It wasn't the first state to consider it. Kentucky had come one vote away 2 years earlier from passing a similar law. It was happening all over the country. It was a national phenomenon. Now, Inherit the Wind, and so it's not at all like the Inherit the Wind story. Now, Inherit the Wind provides a much fuller story. I'll just each I'll mention. And there is Bryan at his oratory best. It provides a fuller extension for the arrival of Clarence Darrow, who is the one with the straw skipper. On his arrival, his supposed arrival to Dayton, being greeted by some local lawyers and John Scopes on the right side. Actually, it's a stage picture. We saw already that Bryan came in on the train with his pit helmet. He was a showman by nature. They were both showmen by nature. Darrow came in by car and drove into town, and when he got into town where he was staying, they said, they're all waiting for you out on the edge of town. He'd come in a different way. So he had to drive back out of town, where all the press were waiting, and drive back into town for this official picture. But Inherit the Wind provides a fuller rationale for Darrow's participation in this small-time misdemeanor trial than it did for Bryan's appearance in it. But even here, the details diverge sharply from the historical record. In the play, a jail Scopes, remember, in the play and in the movie, Scopes is surprised by all this. He is literally teaching evolution, which he's never done, and he's pulled out of the classroom. Or in the play, the court doesn't have as many scenes, so he actually starts with him in the jail, and there is literally a chanting mob outside the jail that you can see, calling a lynch mob, calling the lynching, trying to break him out of jail and lynch him for this. It's not that bad at all. Dayton's not that sort of place. In the play, this jail Scopes appeals to Mencken, who's down there as a reporter, for help in getting a lawyer because nobody will defend him in the town. Mencken then announces that his paper is sending, quote, the most agile legal mind of the 20th century, Clarence Darrow, to which Reverend Brown, when he hears, gasps in the play, the agnostic, a vicious, godless man. Now, truly, that never really happened, but they're actually both pretty fair characterizations of the real Clarence Darrow. By the 1920s, Clarence Darrow unquestionably stood out as the most famous, some would say infamous, trial lawyer in America, born into an educated working-class family in tiny Kinsman, Ohio, tiny little village. Darrow first gained public notice when he defended the famed socialist labor leader Eugene V. Debs against criminal charges growing out of the violent 1894 Pullman strike. For the next 15 years, Darrow was the nation's outstanding labor defense lawyer at a time when labor was more militant and employers more hardened than ever before or after. After this time, after these years as a leading labor lawyer, Darrow gradually broadened his practice to include the defense of wealthy murderers, or wealthy people accused of murder. I should be very careful there, for a very high fee, mind you. Now, these activities kept Darrow's name in the newspapers. They were sort of like the O.J. Simpson trials of the day. such as probably, well, maybe not the most famous, but one of the most famous would be the 1924 Leopold Loeb trial, which occurred in Chicago with Clarence Darrow as the defender. One of the most sensational trials in American history, in which Darrow used arguments of psychological determinism and philosophical determinism to save two wealthy and intelligent Chicago teenagers from execution for their cold-blooded murder of a neighborhood boy. A crime that the defendants apparently committed for no other reason than to see if they could get away with it. Although Darrow's defense, one was a sociopath, one was a psychopath, and the other was a camp follower. Although Darrow's defense outraged many Americans who believed in individual responsibility, it reflected his long-standing and oft-proclaimed belief in materialistic determinism. He was not a scientist, he was purely a lawyer, but he was a very public individual. He was one of the top, like Brian, there were two of the top three speakers in the country in the amount they could command and the amount of speeches they gave. But they gave very different types of speeches. Brian gave political speeches that were basically a mix of progressive politics and conservative traditional Christianity. Darrow's were Richard Dawkins type speeches and legal speeches. Now, Darrow, in these speeches, and in his writings, and in his books, was not content with simply questioning popular notions of criminal responsibility, but delighted in challenging biblical concepts of morality, which he viewed as both wrong and dangerous. So, just to give them an example, Brian, they both were leading opponents and prominent opponents of World War I. But Brian resigned as Secretary of the State in protest of Wilson's drift toward the war. But Brian viewed social Darwinism as the cause of war, while Darrow viewed religion as the cause of war. Now, Darrow welcomed the hullabaloo surrounding the anti-evolution crusade. It rekindled interest in his legalistic attacks on the Bible, which once appeared hopelessly out of date in light of modern developments in mainline Christian thought. Reignited the relevance of his attacks with the perceived rise of the anti-evolution crusade and fundamentalism. When the Scopes trial arose, Darrow volunteered his legal services for the defense. The only time in his life he ever volunteered legal aid. He saw a chance to grab the limelight and debunk fundamentalism, and he loved doing both. He wrote, "My object was to focus the attention of the country on the program of Mr. Bryan and other fundamentalists in America. Thus, unlike the story in Inherit the Wind, Darrow did not need to be, nor was he, sent to Dayton by Mencken's newspaper. Of course, Scopes need not and did not ask Mencken's newspaper to obtain defense counsel, for he only agreed to test the law after the ACLU offered to defend him. It was the ACLU's case from the start, and Darrow would not have joined it if Bryan had stayed out. Then Darrow demanded in. Yet, in the real trial, unlike the movie, Darrow served merely as one member of a star-studded defense team assembled by the ACLU that included Arthur Garfield Hayes, a wealthy Park Avenue lawyer, and there's a team in the movie which just focuses on Spencer Tracy. But the legal team included Arthur Garfield Hayes, and it also included Dudley Field Malone, an even wealthier New York divorce lawyer, drawn in the spotlight of the Scopes litigation. These and other attorneys actually argued much more of the case than Darrow. And the ACLU itself, as well as these other lawyers, were never mentioned in Inherit the Wind. Going back, we see the movie version, you have Scopes and his fictional fiancée, and you have Spencer Tracy playing the Clarence Darrow world, and you've got the reporter, H.L. Mencken, sitting at the counter, not quite like it really happened. There you see the courtroom with the others there, picture from the courtroom. Still looks like that if you go down to Dayton. They haven't removed the courtroom. These other attorneys actually argued most of the case. They're never mentioned. The ACLU is never mentioned in half the week. The omission, of course, simplified. It could have been just simple. You could have said, I have the advantage of talking to all these people. You could have just simplified the script because you need fewer characters. But it also serves another purpose. As they later explained, and this explains the differences between the play and the reality, or the movie and the reality. Jerome Lawrence and Bob Lee wrote the play during the mid-1950s, not in any way to celebrate the then 30-year-old Scopes case. Instead, they wrote it as a means to awaken public concern about the then ongoing innocent victims of the mass hysteria then feeding the McCarthy-era assaults on alleged communists and leftists. The trial was a stand-in for the McCarthy censors. In that sense, it was almost exactly like the Crucible, which was not about the witch trials at all. It was a way to attack what was happening in McCarthyism. And so when you look at the play, in both cases, they don't mimic what really happened. Anybody who was watching them would see the McCarthy era attacks on alleged communists and leftists. And because the ACLU remained a much maligned target of those assaults, identifying its role, its actual role in the Scopes trial, could only make it harder to portray Scopes as an innocent victim. Thus, the ACLU disappeared from the legend of its own most famous trial. Now, the prospects of these renowned orators, particularly Bryan and Darrow, two of the nation's leading speakers and public intellectuals, actually litigating the profound issues of science versus religion and academic freedom versus popular control over public education, turned the trial into a media sensation then and the stuff of legend ever after. News of the trial dominated the headlines in the weeks leading up to it in every newspaper in the country, from Boston to California, and pushed nearly everything off American front pages throughout the 8-day event. So far as I can tell, every major newspaper in the country had word-by-word transcripts the next day of the entire proceedings in Dayton. 200 reporters covered the story in Dayton, including some of the country's best correspondents representing many of the major newspapers and magazines. Thousands of miles, literally thousands of miles of telegraph wire were hung into Dayton to transmit the words spoken on the telegraph around the country. Pioneering live radio broadcasts carried the oratory to the listening public. It was the nation's first broadcast trial, broadcast nationwide over the radio. Newsreel cameras, you can see one in the corner back there. You'll see more as I show some more slides. Newsreel cameras recorded the entire encounter with the film flown directly to major northern cities for showing in the movie halls. Now, there were silent movies then, but what they do is they built the first airstrip ever in Dayton. They flattened a cornfield, I think it's a cornfield, and they let the planes land, and they would film it every day, and then they'd take it up to Cleveland and New York and other places and for the next day. And then people could go and watch it with somebody reading the transcript and then see the trial. The media billed it as the trial of the century before it even began, and it lived up to its billing. By its end, Dayton civic leaders could only marvel at the success of their little publicity stunt and dreams of a way to capitalize on their town's new notoriety, including in the end to try to build a university, raise funds for a university, now college, named after Bryan. This was Southern small-town sensationalism at its stereotypical roaring 20s best. The stage directions and inherit the wind stressed, and I'm quoting here, the town is always visible, looming there. But at trial, if you were there, the media was most visible, looming everywhere. Most of the people had actually moved out of town to rent their homes to the incoming journalists or others who came into town. The courtroom arguments and speeches on both sides addressed the nation rather than the jurors, partly because they missed most of the oratory because it had so little to do with the facts of the case, and the jury gets dismissed when they're not talking about the facts of the case, that the jury was actually in the jury box only two hours of the 8-day long trial. They were very disappointed because while no, even though it's the largest, it happened just by chance to be the largest courthouse in the state of Tennessee, county courthouse. It couldn't hold anybody but the reporters and the telegraph people, the telegraph and the lawyers and the jury. It totally filled up. So the townspeople that were there, or anybody come visited, had to go down to 3 local churches where it was shown, where the radio broadcast was rebroadcast in the, and so they could at least hear it. But the jury couldn't go there because they weren't allowed to hear it. So the juries, everybody wanted to be in the jury, and back then only men could serve on the jury, so they're all male. Only men could be in the courtroom in Ray County. They thought, we're the only ones who are going to get seats. And then they got themselves on the jury, and then they missed the whole show. Sad development. Now, the defense divided its arguments among three principal attorneys. Hayes focused on the standard, and there he is, on the standard ACLU arguments that Tennessee's anti-evolution statute violated the individual rights of teachers. Malone, I showed him earlier, it's not the next picture, I'll have to get, that's the other side. Malone, a modern-minded, liberal-minded Catholic, mostly argued that the scientific theory of evolution did not necessarily conflict with an open-minded reading of Genesis. Darrow, for his part, concentrated on debunking fundamentalist reliance on revealed scripture as a source for knowledge about nature suitable for setting public education standards. Their common goal, as Hayes stated at the time, was, quote, here, to make it possible that laws of this kind will hereinafter meet with an aroused public opinion. In short, they were using this as a soapbox to argue against such laws. Now, the prosecution countered, and here's the prosecution team, with one of the radio microphones nearby. That, by the way, is Malone on the far corner, just above it, but this is the main prosecution team, absent Brian, right there. There were a half dozen local attorneys, led by the state's able prosecutor and future 2 times, thanks to this trial, 2 times elected to the U.S. Senate from Tennessee, Tom Stewart, plus Brian and his son Billy, who came in with his dad, in court, and was also a lawyer. They focused on proving that Scopes broke the law and objected to any attempt to litigate the merits of the underlying statute. Now, Inherit the Wind gives due billing to Tom Stewart under the pseudonym of Tom Davenport, and the other local prosecutors and the younger Brian disappear entirely from the account. The elder Brian, who shown here, near a microphone, in the courtroom, the elder Brian, who had not practiced law for 3 decades, stayed uncharacteristically quiet in court, and he saved his oratory for lecturing the assembled press and the public outside the courtroom in the evenings or in the mornings about the vices of teaching that man evolved from monkeys and the virtues of majority rule. He also prepared a thunderous 3-hour-long address on these points that he planned to deliver as the prosecution's closing argument, because Brian was not quick on his feet, but he was a tremendous stump speaker. You might have heard of his famous Cross of Gold speech at the convention. It gets him the first of his presidential nominees. He was a great speaker of a prepared speech. So he had told everyone, he had worked for months to hew a a closing argument, which is really a tremendous argument. It's still in print. It's a beautiful argument raising the issues at stake. As the actual trial played out, unfortunately, for Bryan, Darrow managed to frustrate Bryan's plan to get by waiving his own closing arguments. And at that time, Tennessee jurisprudence is probably still true. If it's a criminal prosecution and the defense chooses not to give a closing argument, well, then the prosecution can't give a closing argument. So Bryan was left unable to give his prepared speech. He gave it around a few times before he died, but never in the courtroom. In this and in other major scenes from the trial, events unfolded roughly as they did in Inherit the Wind. So let me go through a few of those and you can see how the differences work. Like any criminal trial, in the court or in the play, Inherit the Wind, first comes jury selection. Now, Darrow typically stressed this particular aspect, and there is the jury being sworn in. Darrow typically stressed this part of the trial as critical for the defense, and often used weeks. Remember, he'd been the most famous lawyer in the country. Everybody followed his trials. They were reported news. And he pioneered a lot of the modern techniques that lawyers use. If you ask lawyers today of a poll of who is the greatest lawyer, Darrow still wins in a landslide of American lawyers. And jury selection was one of his specialties. And he would often take weeks to go through hundreds of endearment before settling on 12 jurors who just might be willing and be open to his arguments and acquit his typically notorious defendant, or at least to get a hung jury. Now, Darrow, though, had an entirely different object at the Scopes trial. He wanted to convict the statute, not acquit the defendant. And only judges can overturn the statute, either at the trial, which is very difficult, or on appeal, to the Tennessee Supreme Court or to the U.S. Supreme Court. Jurors simply apply the law to the facts of the case. So Darrow could have easily won an acquittal by simply arguing that Scopes, who after all was not a biology teacher and had never taught evolution, simply pointing out he never taught evolution, and he would have gotten an acquittal. But that would have left the law intact, and they want to challenge the law. Instead, the defense sought either to have the trial judge strike the statute, which again was all but impossible under Tennessee jurisprudence rules of that time, or to have Scopes convicted and then appeal to a higher court, which could review the constitutionality or legality of the statute. So rather than spend weeks seeking jurors open to acquitting Scopes despite the law, Darrow quickly accepted the simplest of endearment. Their presence on the jury, the defense reasoned, would dramatize to the watching nation the spectacle of non-experts sitting in judgment on a scientific theory, which actually constituted their key objection to the statute at all. Why should legislators decide what is appropriate to teach in a science classroom? Now, this strategy hit pay dirt when one of the endearment being questioned by Darrow, turned out to be illiterate. His exchange with Darrow became the subject of countless news stories then, and needed little exaggeration in later accounts. Inherit the Wind almost tracks it exactly. It's one of the few places that's right. Well, here's the Inherit the Wind version. Darrow says to this juror, "Ever read anything in a book about evolution?" "Nope," which is a typical response. Right? Darrow then follows up, "Sure, but I bet you read your Bible." Again, "Nope." Darrow looks puzzled. When a puzzled Darrow, then he asks the endearment, "Why is that?" He simply replies, "Can't read." To ensure the viewers get the point, stage directions add, and I'm quoting here, "There are a few titters throughout the courtroom before Darrow declares boldly, 'He'll do.'" Well, no sooner had the jury been selected than it was excused from the courtroom for days. Oh man, you see, Brian, excused from the courtroom for days as the parties wrangled over the defense motions to strike the statute as unconstitutional. Although these arguments sometimes soared into dramatic pleas for either academic freedom on one side or majority rule on the other, their technical nature makes them difficult to follow by non-lawyers, and the trial judge, of course, denied all the motions anyway. Inherent the Wind just skips over them because they're not the story Inherent the Wind's trying to tell. And they skip directly to the prosecution's case after those are all over, which actually was even simpler than portrayed in the movie account. The scene begins with a schoolboy named Howard Morgan, and I actually got to meet him once, quite old by that time, but Howard Morgan in the actual trial. He testified that Scopes taught his class about evolution. On cross-examination, Darrow asked Howard the famous question, did it do you any harm? And coaches out a denial. Morgan, if you see the movie, or if you read the transcript, remains a gee-whiz, baseball-loving, all-American boy, untainted by his experience with Darwinism. Ask some of the questions. You still love your mother and your dad? Yeah. You still play third base? Yeah. Then the play concocts testimony from Scopes' fictional fiance. He did not have fiance, who Brian mercilessly grills about Scopes' agnosticism. This, the writers later explained, was inserted to discredit McCarthy-era inquisitions into the families and friends of alleged communists. It gives a dark taint to the trial and to Brian, largely missing from the actual episode, in which Scopes actually had to instruct his own students how to testify that he had taught evolution. He had to meet with them and say, it's okay, go up and say I taught evolution. Even though he hadn't. And where Brian had offered publicly to pay Scopes' fine if he was convicted. Now, following the prosecutor's brief presentation, the defense offers a testimony of 15 expert witnesses. There they are, in science and religion. Theologians, biologists, geologists from America's top universities, from Harvard, from Princeton, from Chicago, and from Hopkins, and also from locally from Vanderbilt and the Tennessee State geologist. All prepared to testify against the statute. All carefully chosen because they were believing Christians. All acted in their church. All taught Sunday school. They had carefully picked this group. The admissibility of such testimony was key to the defense issue at the trial. Now, it passes quickly in Inherent the Wind. In Dayton, it consumed several days of debate over whether these guys could testify. The script of the movie captures the heart of the matter, however. Their testimony is baseless to the defense of my case, Darrow pleads. For it is my intent to show that this court, that what John Scopes spoke quietly one spring afternoon in Dayton High School is no crime. It is as incontrovertible as geology. Now, Brian formally objects to the testimony as irrelevant to the narrow question of whether Scopes ever taught evolution. And that has been established by the prosecution's witness by bringing up Howard and other school children to say that he had. The judge predictably sided with the prosecution. Everyone knew he was going to side with the prosecution. And this made Scopes', if the expert witnesses could not testify and therefore challenge the statute, and the judge did not strike the statute on constitutional grounds, this made Scopes' conviction inevitable. Stage directions then lead to this scene, the most famous scene of it all. Stage directions for the play then instruct Darrow to appear, quote, flabbergasted, to look around helplessly when his motion to let this expert speak, until there's the glint of an idea in his eye. Now, I don't know any actor in history, in recent American history, who is better at having a glint in his eye than Spencer Tracy. But I also know no lawyer who would be least likely to appear flabbergasted and helpless by any development in court than Clarence Darrow. This sets the stage for the most dramatic battle of the century. At least this is how this is a scene from a promo for the movie. And it sets the most dramatic scene of Inherit the Wind. It also sets up the most dramatic event at the actual trial in Dayton. And that was that Clarence Darrow, shown here when he did it, Clarence Darrow, or the defense, calls Bryan to the stand as an expert on religion. Now, it was equally dramatic at the time, the actual event, although Darrow had quietly planned it for days. Because he saw this coming, he even had people play the role of William Jennings Bryan and have mock questioning ahead of time. It was all planned, it was all prepared. Because he was a good lawyer. And it became the most famous scene in American legal history or cinema, legal cinema. And it really happened, though not quite like portrayed in Inherit the Wind. Actually, it was Hayes, the technic, called Bryan to the stand as the defense finals witnesses. And the volunteer prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, who volunteered to be a prosecutor in the case, proved cooperative. Up to this point, the chief prosecutor, your future senator, Tom Stewart, had masterfully confined the proceedings and, with the help of a friendly judge, and that always helps, controlled his wily opponents. But Stewart could not control his impulsive co-counsel, especially because the judge seemed eager to hear Bryan defend the faith. Stewart, as soon as he was called, jumped to his feet and objected, and he would subsequently object 37 times in the next 2 hours to the proceeding going forward. But Bryan insisted. They did not come here, and this is from the actual transcript, they did not come here to try this case. They came here to try revealed religion, and I'm here to defend it. And they can ask me any questions they please. Well, Darrow did just that. Thinking the trial, you'll notice that it doesn't look like he's in a courtroom, because you see a tree in the background. Good observation, if you notice that. Thinking the trial all but over, except for the much-awaited closing oratory, because everybody's waiting for William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow to give their closing statements, the judge, who was up for re-election that year, had moved the afternoon session outside to the courthouse lawn. Women could not go in the courtroom, so they hadn't seen anything. And there were only 500 seats in the courtroom, and they were all full. But now the crowd swelled as word spread of the encounter between Bryan and Darrow. From the 500 people that evacuated the courtroom, the number rose to an estimated 3,000 people spread over the lawn, nearly twice the town's normal population. The participants appeared on a crude wooden platform, you see part of it there, erected for the, which had been erected actually as a bandstand to entertain all the visitors at night, during the nights of the trial. And so appearing on that, they looked much like Punch and Judy puppets performing at an outdoor festival. Enterprising youngsters passed through the crowd hawking refreshments to people. It was a festival. Now, Darrow posed the age-old questions of the village skeptic. Did Jonah live in the whale for 3 days? How could Joshua lengthen the day by making the sun rather than the earth stand still? Because it would only work. If you want to lengthen the day, you have to keep the earth from rotating, unless you believe that the sun goes around the earth. Then you can make the sun stand still. And where did Cain, who was allegedly one of the only 2 children of the only 2 people, Adam and Eve, where did he get his wife? Well, in a narrow sense, as Stewart persistently complained and objected and objected and objected, Darrow's question had nothing to do with the case because they never once inquired about evolution. In a broad sense, as Hayes repeatedly countered, they had everything to do with it because they challenged biblical literalism, which stood at the heart of the anti-evolution statute. And Darrow, being a good lawyer, the last thing he wanted to do was get an opening for Brian to speak about evolution, because he had prepared speeches about the problems of evolutionary teaching. So he never broached that subject. As Darrow later explained, these were the sort of questions that have been asked for hundreds of years, and there are no good answers to them. As Darrow explained, they compelled Brian, as he wrote, to choose between his crude beliefs and the common intelligence of modern times or admit ignorance. Well, Brian tried all three strategies at different times during the afternoon without appreciable success. Darrow questioned Brian as a hostile witness, peppering him with questions and giving him little chance to answer. It became like a firing times. You claim that everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted. Well, I believe everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there. Some of the Bible is given illustratively, cut off. But when you read that the whale swallowed Jonah, now how do you literally interpret that? I believe in a God that can make a whale and can make a man and can make both of them do as he pleases, cut off. But no, you're not answering the question, Mr. Brian. Do you believe in them? Not that it could happen. Do you believe that he made such a fish and that it was big enough to swallow Jonah? Yes, sir, after some delay. Yes, sir, let me add, one miracle is just as easy to believe as another. Brian, Darrow came back. It is for me just as hard. Brian, it is hard to believe for you, but easy for me. When you get beyond what man can do, when you get within the realm of miracles, it is just as easy to believe the miracle of Jonah as any other miracle in the Bible. Now, such affirmations undercut the appeal of fundamentalism to many Americans at the time. On the stump, Brian never talked about stuff like that. He effectively championed the cause of biblical faith by addressing the great questions of life. The special creation of humans in God's image gave purpose to every person, and the bodily resurrection of Christ gave hope for believers for eternal life. But Darrow never inquired about these grand miracles. For many Americans, laudable simple faith becomes laughable crude belief when applied to Jonah's whale or Noah's flood or Adam's rib. Yet, that afternoon, under oath, Brian acknowledged accepting each of these biblical miracles on faith and publicly professing that all miracles were just as easy to believe. Now, Brian fared little better when he tried to rationalize two biblical passages raised by Darrow. In an apparent concession to modern astronomy, for example, Brian suggested that God extended the length of the day, daylight, for Jonah by stopping the earth from spinning rather than the sun from going around the earth. Similarly, in line with 19th century evangelical scholarship, Brian affirmed that his understanding that each of the 6 days of creation in the Genesis account represented periods of time, so-called day-age theory, not 24 hours a day, leading to the following exchange with Darrow asking the questions. You have no idea of the length of these periods? No, I do not. Do you think the sun was made on the 4th day? Yes. So they had morning and evening for 4 days without the sun? I simply said it was a period. Oh, then they had morning and evening for 4 periods without the sun. Is that what you think? I believe in creation as they're told, and if I'm not able to explain it, I will accept it. Now, although Brian had not veered far beyond the bounds of biblical literalism as understood at the time, the defense made the most of it. Hayes gloated, Brian had conceded that he interpreted the Bible. He must agree that evolutionists have the same right and argue for theistic evolution. It came up again with the age of the earth. He said, so, Darrow returns to that. So you believe the world was created in 6,000 years ago, in 404 BC, 4,400 BC. No, I don't know when the earth was created. And he said, But that's what it says in the Bible. Oh, those are Bishop Ussher's calculations. I don't know if they're right. I don't care, he said, whether the earth is 6,000 years old or 600,000 years old or 600 million years old. What I care more about the rock of ages than the age of rocks. Well, as Darrow pushed his various lines of questioning, Brian increasingly admitted that he simply did not know the answers. He had no idea what would happen to the earth if it stopped for Jonah, or about the antiquity of ancient civilization. Did you ever discover where Cain got his wife? Darrow asked at one point. No, sir, I leave the agnostics to hunt for her, came the bittersweet reply. These aren't from the movie. This is from the actual events of Dayton. Now, Stewart tried to stop the 2-hour interrogation, and I'd said at least 3 dozen times with objection. But Brian refused to stop. I am simply trying to protect the Word of God against the greatest atheist or agnostic in the United States, he shouted, pounding his fist in rage. I want the papers to know that I am not afraid, and there he is on the stand, I am not afraid to get on the stand in front of him and let him do his worst. Now the crowd cheered this outburst. The transcript shows crowd cheering. Indeed, it cheered every counter thrust he made. The crowd was with him. Darrow received little applause, but he inflicted the most jabs. The only purpose Mr. Darrow has is to stir the Bible, but I will answer his questions, Brian exclaimed at one point. I object to your statement, Darrow shouted back. Both men now standing, shaking their fists at each other. I object to your statement. I am examining your fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes. The judge, when he heard that, had finally heard enough. He abruptly adjourned the court for the day, and he never let the interrogation resume the next day. Instead, the next day, the jury duly convicted Scopes, on the request, mind you, of Clarence Darrow, so that it could be appealed. As bad as it was for Brian on that hot day in July in Dayton, Tennessee, Inherit the Wind makes it much worse. And there's the picture of Frederick Marshall, Inherit the Wind in this scene. Here, in the movie, Brian appears as a mindless, reactionary creature of the mob. Rather than, in the movie and play, same way, he assails evolution solely on narrow biblical grounds, never suggesting the broad social concerns that largely motivated him. And denounces all science, in the movie, he denounces all science as godless, rather than only Darwinism as godless, not other science. And unlike at the real trial, the crowd, in the movie, the crowd, as you'd expect, gradually slips away from him as he inexplicably begins babbling on, reciting the names of the Old Testament. And then fatally collapses in the courtroom when the now hostile crowd turns against him and his speech. Now, as the playwrights debunk Brian in the eyes of the audience, they uplift Clarence Darrow. He remains a self-proclaimed agnostic, but loses his crusading materialism. At the end, it is Mencken who delivers him in the movie. It's Mencken who delivers Darrow's famous slur about Brian's fool religion that no intelligent Christian believes, and it is Darrow who reacts with anger. You smart aleck, you have no more right to spit on his religion than you have a right to spit on my religion or my lack of religion. Thus the writers reduce Brian and Darrow to one-dimensional caricatures of themselves and simplify the trial into a 3-act morality play in which tolerance happily triumphs over religious bigotry. To ensure the viewers may get this point, the writers have Scopes ask Darrow after the jury convicts him, "Did I win or did I lose?" And Darrow answers, "You won. Millions of people will say you won. They'll read in the papers tonight that you smashed a bad law, that you made it a joke." Well, this is fine theater, if you want theater. But it hobbles efforts to understand the trial's complex historical legacy, where Bryan actually made some very effective points. And it is Darrow who asked the jury to convict Scopes so that he could take the law up on appeal. Although partisans on both sides claimed the advantage, after the trial, Bryan said, "We won, Scopes was convicted, we can have other laws like this." Darrow said, "We debunked the law, people won't want to do it anymore." Both sides claimed the advantage. At the time, most neutral observers viewed the trial as a draw, and no one thought decisive. This was, as I said, front page news in every paper in the country, and I went back and checked all those papers because they all wrote editorials, the next day editorials, on what did this trial mean. And not a single one of those editorials, from the New York Times to the most conservative Memphis papers or Atlanta papers, none of them thought the trial was decisive. All of them thought this is only going to get bigger. America's adversarial legal system tends to drive parties apart rather than reconcile them, and that certainly resulted in this case. Despite Bryan's stumbling on the witness stand, which even his supporters could easily say, well, who wouldn't look like a fool if they were being cross-examined by Clarence Darrow, the devil himself? Both sides had effectively communicated their message from Dayton. Oh, maybe not well enough to win many converts, but at least sufficiently to energize those already leaning in their direction and for them to make evolution versus creation a cause, a central cause of the cultural wars, which it had not been before. They both succeeded in energizing the issue. So if, as Inherit the Wind declares, millions of people thereafter dismissed anti-evolution as a joke, millions more saw it as a cause. And when Bryan did die a week later in Dayton, they acquired a martyr to this cause. Huge crowds turned out to watch a special train. Millions of people turned out as a special train carried his body from Dayton for burial in a state funeral in Arlington State Cemetery, in D.C., where every single pallbearer was a sitting United States senator. Consequently, the pace of anti-evolutionism actually quickened after the trial. It didn't go down, but also encountered greater resistance as well. 2 other states and countless local school districts passed similar laws or measures modeled on the Tennessee law. But similar proposals encountered unexpected resistance in other states. Probably the most interesting ones of this sort occurred in 1927 when one Rhode Island legislator introduced such a bill in his state. But the House in Rhode Island, instead of submitting it to the Committee on Education, where they would typically go, instead his bemused colleagues referred it to the Committee on Fish and Game, where it died without a hearing or a vote. Well, of course, this divided and divisive response continues on this issue to the present, as some school officials impose restriction on teaching evolution and others ridicule it. With time and countless retellings, and there are Scopes at the conviction, and there they are, posed together. With time and countless retellings, the Scopes trial has become a part of American folklore, indeed, part of the fabric of American culture. It grew to symbolize, and appears not only in Inherit the Wind, but in many other books of literature or fiction or nonfiction. It grew to symbolize not simply anti-evolutionism, but socially conservative, religiously motivated interventions in public policy generally. Indeed, the issues raised by the Scopes trial and Inherit the Wind endure precisely because they embody the characteristic American struggle between individual liberty and majority rule, and cast it in the timeless debate over science and religion, leading us in large part, as presented not at the trial, but in the movie, to misunderstand both. To misunderstand science and religion, to misunderstand the debate, to misunderstand individual liberty and majority rule. The Scopes trial somehow became the yardstick by which the former battle was measured and the glass through which the later debate was seen. I followed this through by checking, and I found that countless times when this issue or other issues arise and there's another trial, you can look at the headlines in newspapers right up to today. And when the trial occurs, it's billed in the headlines or in the descriptions as Scopes 2 or Son of Scopes. It's never billed. But wait, there's like that in the 40s, like that in the 50s. And why isn't one Scopes 3? Or the grandson of Scopes? No, the public mind jumps all the way back to Scopes and sees it through that lens and all the fallacies of that lens, because they see it through the folklore of that trial. In its review of Inherit the Wind, in the recent Broadway revival, the New York Times described the original courtroom confrontation as, quote, one of the most colorful and briefly riveting of the trials of the century that seemed to be especially abundant in the sensation-loving 1920s. Well, dozens of prosecutions, I will agree, at the Times in part, have received the designation over the 20th century as the trial of the century, all the way up to O.J. Simpson or dozens of others. But only the Scopes trial fully lived up to its billing by continuing to echo in American culture, not only through that century, but into our own. Nearing 100 years later, it remains as relevant today as an actual trial and as folklore than it ever was. Thank you. You want to see it continuing to live, you can go every summer, but every summer for the last 30 years, they reenact the trial, or their version of the trial, in Dayton. You can go to Ray County and see it plays. It plays on those days. And that's the 75th anniversary they had me back to. And I've lived long enough to go back to the 100th.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Larson. I think we have time for a few questions, and you can sit or not if you'd prefer to stand.
I'd be happy to do whichever. I'll let you identify the question.
Well, I will start with a question of my own,
Yes.
which is how has the Scopes and the echoes of the Scopes folklore, you think, affected public perception of science today, specifically as it relates to kind of this subset of our population who denies vaccines or through the COVID pandemic? How has that played out?
I'm going to play out that in two ways. I'm going to answer your question, and then I'm going to add one more to it. It plays out in different audiences, different ways. But one effect of the actual Scopes trial, only reinforced by the legend, was a popular distrust by conservative Christians of science and of their place at the table. Because if you go back before this, just as Brian believed in the day-age theory, almost every even founders of the fundamentalist movement, if you can look through the Fundamentals, which is the original book where all the essays by fundamentalist ministers, it was published, in 1910, that was sent out to pastors to try to bring them back to the faith, none of them accept a young earth creationism. Some of them by the day-age theory, which is in the Schofield Reference Bible, the so-called Bible of the Fundamentalists, as is the gap theory. Both of them actually presents both in the Schofield Reference Bible. But many of the authors in the Fundamentals, which is the doctrine that created the fundamentalist movement, believe in theistic evolution. they don't have any problem. As long as God's guiding evolution, they accept theistic evolution, as Francis Collins would of that sort today. That ends. And you get a movement that we're not allowed at the table. We're ridiculed at the table. And it created a sharp edge, which is what legal trials do. That's the unfortunate using not a legislative revolution, but a legal trial, which is so bright side. But on the other side, you can ask, who's the editor? I'm trying to think of the editor of Zygon. You probably read Zygon. Philip. But Zygon works in close cooperation with biologists that you're part of.
Right.
And he blamed Phil Heffen, I think his name is, and he's a very sympathetic to this sort of biologist, sort of, reaching out, working together, and he views the Scopes trial as the American Galileo's trial, and it made many scientists believe that, just as it made conservative Christians feel they had no place at the table. And Inherit the Wind only made this worse. On the other side, the scientists believe that there's a hostility. We don't want anything to do with these people. It's like they're going to put us under house arrest. And so if they had seen the actual trial, it didn't have that feel at all. William Jennings Bryan didn't have that feel. And even Clarence Darrow didn't have quite that feel. But the way it gets portrayed, it creates a harsh edge to our culture. And stories, and I know your dean knows about the power of stories. Stories have power and in culture. And these stories resonated in that way and drove a wedge.
Sure. Dean Holmes.
Yes, so since you picked up on that, I was going to ask another question, but since you talked about stories and the power of stories, as you know, someone we know really well often talks about the power of story in this way, that there are certain tropes that create narratives, and those narratives become unexamined arguments. So when you talk about Inherit the Wind, what sort of tropes about science and religion are presented in that movie that create or reinforce a cultural narrative that ends up becoming an unexamined argument? Because that's the way, in my limited expertise, I would trace your sophisticated argument, Dr. Larson. So again, what would be the tropes in Inherit the Wind that create this larger cultural narrative that ends up producing an unexamined argument?
You got my thrust. I agree totally with the thrust of your question. And as for, there was the sense that religious objections, because they carefully took out all of Bryan's social objections. And again, Bryan was arguing against only the human evolution and only a Darwinian theory, a sort of a stereotyped Darwinian theory of evolution presiding by a survival of the fittest process, and chance variation, which was not really a fair interpretation of of Charles Darwin's theory. But he was approaching against that. And so by taking out all of the cultural arguments and by only putting in literalistic, because just as on the witness stand, he said he believed in an old Earth theory. He didn't care whether the Earth was 6,000 years old or 600 million years old. In Inherit the Wind, he says, how old's the Earth? And he says, this is what they have in play. You can read it right in the plate strip. It was created in 4004 BC at the is right in there, 9:04 a.m. in the morning. And the question then comes back, is that Eastern Standard Time? And so by making a stereotype, people who follow that cultural interpretation see their opponents in equally simplistic terms. So you can't, rather than looking for the underlying concerns and trying to deal with the consensus in that issue or in climate change or in vaccines or whatever, you end up with that party, the science party, dealing in a stereotype of who their opponents are. Rather than respect their opponents, Brian had rational arguments that he effectively presented. That's why he gained credibility. And it would be the same on the other side. The stereotypes that get perpetrated of scientists not caring a bit about anything else and being totally godless, that is a stereotype that doesn't play out in reality. But you end up, the tropes come in of a atheistic science that cares nothing about humanity, cares nothing about the things Darwin talked about, like the misuse of science with eugenics, which he specifically talked about. No, that's all not mentioned at all, though those things happened. And if you think about those things, and at the same time, you get tropes about atheistic science on one side and high intellectuals from Princeton or wherever, lording it over the people and not caring what people believe. But on the other side, stereotypes that these scientists get and the elites get, that these are just mindless objections that are based on an uninformed, irrational reading of certain selected parts of the Bible rather than a nuanced theology that draws the various ideas together. And so the result is, how can you communicate between those two?
Dr. Cobb.
So first of all, thank you for making that entertaining and accessible, the actual history that occurred there. So the question, some people describe art as a lie that tells a greater truth. We said in painting, sculpture, movie making. So as a historian, how do you actually feel about the artistic, lack of a better word, misrepresentation of history to teach some relevant, culturally relevant thing in the part of the era, for instance? How do you feel when history is misrepresented in a real way like that?
Well, as a historian, I use Inherit the Wind, and it's a very good question. I used Inherit to Win to teach the 1950s, not to teach the 1920s. You can't teach it's a total misrepresentation of the 1920s, though I'll have to admit, unfortunately, the Standard National History Guidelines recommends it as a movie to show about the 1920s. And I objected vehemently to that. You can use it to learn about the 1950s, learning about a very different situation, and use it to explain sort of the McCarthyism tax on communists, because it does somewhat capture that. I view the play as a beautiful production of play for tolerance, because the play is very effective. It ends with, as I showed in one of those pictures, it ends with, after all this goes through, Spencer Tracy is leaving, and he looks over and see Brian's Bible's still there, because Brian, remember, in the movie has died in the courtroom, and as opposed to a week later. And he, now, after going through this, he picks up the Bible, and he first says, oh, they forgot, and then he says, he picks it up, and he sort of weighs it like this, and he picks up his law book, which he's also carrying, and he sort of holds them in the balance, and then slaps them together and puts it in his briefcase and carries them both out. That is, he has grown by this. It showed openness to tolerance. And so if you accept it as a critique of McCarthyism and as a play extolling tolerance, it's a nice work of art. But if you try to use it as a history of the Scopes trial or of the creation-evolution dispute as it was in the 20s, it's just awful history.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have an observation about the role that the media played in the actual event, and is there any parallels with the role that the media plays today?
That's a very interesting question. The media was played to their audience. Not wholly, but for the most part, the media played to its audience. The clearest example of that would have been H.L. Mencken, who was a columnist he had his own magazine, the Mercury, and he also was a regular columnist, syndicated columnist nationwide out of the Baltimore Sun. I think it was the Sun, but a Baltimore newspaper. The Sage of Baltimore, they called him. And he was very, very popular. And he put a spin on it that is the spin that ends up at the time. But remember, he was viewed as a commentator. So he presented that Dayton, which totally surprised them. Dayton thought they'd present it as, they didn't pass the statute. They were just having a test case. They'd never it was East Tennessee, Republican East Tennessee. The county had never voted for Bryan. The state was all Democratic legislators. They had a Republican legislator. They had no oar in this fight. They thought they were putting on a test case. It would be interesting. They called it a summer Chautauqua or a summer institute and a summer university. They used all those terms. But then Mencken decides that the best story to sell would be, because he was very much against the laws. He was a crusader against laws like this. He was agnostic, if not an atheist, and a very militant, secular, very conservative. Sort of an Ayn Rand sort of conservative, very much against religion. And he said the story that'll sell, remember, 1925, North versus South, educated versus uneducated, small town versus city. This is when people were moving to the cities. And so he created a caricature when he got there, so much so that eventually he has to leave town because he's threatened with a physical attack. The stories, at first they greeted him because he was a famous journalist, but his stories were coming out. So in that sense, it would be try to get your news from either MSNBC or Fox News. I mean, they're both commentators. Whether you watch Hannity or Rachel Maddow, they're not presenting the news, they're presenting their opinion. And it can be very entertaining, and H.L. Mencken can be very entertaining. But he's very even though he's from Baltimore, it's very anti-South and very anti-rural and very anti-fundamentalism. And so that picks up. And there are other papers that picked up that's the story that sells. Whether it be the New York Times, even the Chicago Tribune, which was a conservative paper, picked up, but who, because they were Republican, they hated William Jennings Bryan. They pick up this sort of north-south, rural-urban. By the way, anti-evolutionism was not a rural-based phenomenon. It was led by the Moody Bible Institute and Biola. They're based in Chicago and in Los Angeles. And the lead, probably the most visible people were William Bell Riley, who was in Minneapolis, and T.T. Shields, who was in Toronto. These are the leaders of the anti-evolution. They're not in the South. They're in the North or the West. They're not rural. They're urban, because that's where the issue hit. And this wasn't an issue in a small town. I mean, these issues didn't hit in the small towns yet. So but you get some Southern papers that then get very defensive. And so there's some Atlanta papers, some Memphis papers that, have stories that Darrow is literally the devil, and and cartoons of him being with the horns and the whole bit. And some of the papers try to do it. There are a few that try to present it fairly, and probably the best is the greatest reporter of the time out from Tennessee, Joseph Wood Crouch, who I don't know if he's from Nashville or Chattanooga, but he had then moved north, and he was a world famous, a tremendous reporter. I think he was Chattanooga. And so he was hired to go back there by a leading magazine and newspaper to write it up. And he worked closely with the Southern agrarians here in Nashville, who were sympathetic but wanted to have a balanced view. And so if you read Crouch's account, Joseph Wood Crouch's, they're very sympathetic and try to understand. So there were people who tried to get it right. But a lot of the media, this was the days of yellow journalism. and they went right to what would sell their audience. And so you could be reading it like Fox News or MSNBC rather than somebody trying to present a balanced report. And so the media did aggravate it at the time.
Dr. Gonzalez.
Perhaps it's an ironic question, but in that time, there was a legislation passed and then a challenge to it. Fast forward to Tennessee legislature, things happen in current events. There's always an effort to get the Bible to be the book of Tennessee. There's recently legislation passed, against anything that has an echo of critical race theory. So in 100 years, have we evolved?
No, it's a good point. It's very similar. A particular legislator from Butler threw this bill out. Brian had been in there and made his big cause, and his bill had been defeated in the state senate. And but at the last minute, when the legislation, the Austin Peay's legislation, to for the first time have state-supported higher education, secondary education, high schools. The state was already supporting K through 8 grade schools. They only had grade schools and high schools then. And Dayton's high school had just recently been built, and this was state funding for that. This gets thrown out, and it's the last minute, and nobody thinks, and not enough people wanted to vote against it. It had been a big issue in many states. As I said, it had gone down by 1 vote in Kentucky. It had been very close in North Carolina. Some other states had compromised by passing lesser restrictions. Oklahoma had passed a statute saying you couldn't put evolution in the textbooks, but they didn't control what teachers taught. Florida had passed a resolution saying teachers should not teach human evolution. Tennessee was the first state to actually make it a crime to teach it with a penalty. But yeah, they jumped aboard. Went as sort of a balance. Austin Peay was amazing. Austin Peay, who was considered a progressive governor generally, I think you have a state college named after him today. He had wanted so much to get his bill passed with funding for high school education that he was opposed to the bill, but he said he'd sign it because he looked it over very closely, and he also looked over the textbook, Hunter's Civic Biology, the one at issue, which is totally evolutionary, and almost was an indictment because it included arguments for eugenics and scientific racism in it. It was as bad as you could get, and it was as evolutionary as you could be. And he said, I looked over the textbook, and the textbook's fine. It wouldn't violate the law. Almost unbelievable. But yeah, that whole sense is what you see sometimes happening. So yeah, did they involve very much? I don't think our politics has moved very far. I think if anything, it's become more divided. But this was one of the cause of the growing division. The parties have shifted. It was the Democratic Party pushing these bills back then. The Democratic Party was, of course, allied with the Ku Klux Klan, which was very powerful in the South. The governor, the senator of Alabama had just been elected solely as a Klan candidate, as an unknown, Hugo Black. And the Klan supported the bill. So it was that, I don't think we've evolved all that much. You're right. I think it's a good point.
Young man right here in the middle.
So, is there a reason that Tennessee made it illegal to teach that?
It was just chance that it happened to be Tennessee first. This was truly a national crusade. There were bills in over 40 states. Brian had actually campaigned in over 20 of them and spoken to a joint session of the legislature in everyone that was controlled by Democrats. The Republicans, of course, wouldn't let him in. But everyone controlled. So it was, it was from Wisconsin, it was Maine, it was Washington State, it was all over. Tennessee just happened to be, and they weren't even targeting, they were targeting North Carolina. That's where they thought they'd get it passed. Now, it's just chance, but you're right, stories build. And since the story started in Tennessee, Tennessee then later became the first law to pass an equal time law. That is a law requiring equal time. Later, in a later generation, when creationism comes, rather than banning evolution, the idea was to give equal time to creation and evolution. And later, Arkansas and Louisiana will pass ones, but the first to do it was Tennessee. And it was the same way with the academic freedom statutes a few years ago, which restrict, says that, has restrictions on teaching evolution is one, climate change is another. There are a couple other, 4 things that are they're called academic freedom statutes. They were pushed nationally. Tennessee happened to be the first to pass one of those, and then other states follow. So a story begins, and it begins in Tennessee. And the legacy continues from it. And Dayton's changed. Dayton was not a hotbed of this back then. They didn't even have what we would call an evangelical church, because it was mostly filled with immigrant Scottish people and transients and new people to town. It didn't even have anything that would qualify as what we would now call a fundamentalist church, certainly, or even an evangelical church. Now it's filled with them. So stories build. So it's a good question. They weren't predicting Tennessee would have been the first to move on this. And it's just a chance of local occurrences happening to overlap, and there was the result. And it happened. It was boosted along. There, Billy Sunday, who was the most famous evangelist of the day, when he hears, he's even more than Brian comes in, and then the Senate bill's defeated. And then there's this new effort. And Billy Sunday, who's the Billy Graham of his day, the biggest evangelist there was, and he usually was booked 5 years in advance, he cancels a crusade and has a crusade in Tennessee at the very time that the last 2 weeks of the legislature. And it's absolutely packed. And he's every night pushing for this passage. So but of course he wasn't from Tennessee. So it's a constellation of factors that lead Tennessee to get first in the post of this one.
I think we got time for one more, and Dr. Bradshaw.
I'm honored to have the last question. So this 1925 is 2 years before the Solvay conference, in which the major players in quantum theory will convene and introduce another revolutionary idea. Maybe not as, arguably, I would argue, as revolutionary as Darwin's idea.
He's a physicist.
Although I'll point out also it has not ever been put on trial. So maybe but here you have the law, science, the media, and religion, all estates having some claim to truth. In the 1920s, what might have been considered a big T truth. And I wonder, you used the word modern at one point. Do you think this was the signal of the death of modernism?
That's a wonderful question. And it very much was, both in reality and how presented, a modern and not a postmodern trial. The arguments that you hear now about relative truth and all that, it was a battle about truth. And it was contesting viewpoints of truth. And remember, all the expert witnesses the ACLU brought, and they brought 14 superstars, including Matthew Shaler, the most famous theologian at the time, top theologians from Chicago and different theological schools, top scientists. But everyone was a professing Christian, and all the scientists taught Bible study classes. They all wrote tracts. They were all like a Francis Collins, is who they brought in. They were trying. The ACLU was trying. Now, Darrow had a different axe to grind than the ACLU, but the ACLU was trying, and to present one that would speak to in the middle, which got lost because H.L. Mencken didn't want it that way either. The press didn't want it because that wasn't the story that sold. And so it was a modern event. It was a debate over truth, and sides were contending for the truth of what was involved. So that was, but it's interesting you do mention that group, because the trial was not only an American phenomenon. They had reporters from Europe. They had reporters from England, from Germany, from Japan. They had reporters, and they had comments in the newspapers by Bohr, by Einstein, and they were saying, what is happening in America? What is happening? This is just unbelievable. And so, yeah, even the founders of both relativity theory and of quantum mechanics were commenting on the time, on the trial, and them coming from a German religious viewpoint. And some of these people were from the Christian tradition, and of course Einstein was from the Jewish religion. And religion meant a lot to Einstein in his own way. But if you go to Max Planck or Bohr or Heisenberg, they were all commenting on this trial. And they could not, in light of German scholarship on the Bible, they just couldn't understand what was happening. And so it reinforced their stereotypes of America that these people had. So yeah, even physicists were weighing in on this. And I do think that this was very much viewed in by modern context, he means, which now, if we're postmodern, of big T truths. Yeah. And with the viewpoint being pushed that you would today depict that the ACLU and none of their experts would have ever suggested that anything but what we would call theistic evolution be taught. They weren't pushing for materialistic evolution because they knew they weren't going to get anywhere with that. I don't know what they might have actually believed, but maybe Darrow. But they were putting for an accommodation of science and religion that they thought could be made and should be made. And they thought public schools shouldn't be promoting a particular viewpoint, and they were arguing for freedom to speak of different ideas and let those ideas filter through.
All right. Let's thank Dr. Larson again.
Thank you.
I've asked Dr. Lawrence to come up and lead us in a closing prayer. And after we recess, there are refreshments outside. And judging by the number of people that are left at this point, you all need to eat about 10 cookies apiece.
And I do want to wish all of you a very happy Easter.
Yeah. There are tables outside and inside, so enjoy yourselves, converse as we close. John?
Let's pray. Gracious Father, just thank you for the universe that we live in, the universe that you've created, Father. The details, the way that we can look at it from different points of view, the way that we have the opportunity to search for truth, Father. The truth that is embedded in the things that you've created, Father. We thank you for Ed and his scholarship, the way that he's told this story tonight, but also in his book. And Father, we are, as human beings, flawed and sometimes very narrow-minded. Father, help us as Christians to open those doors wide where we can see the things that you want us to see, search for the things you want us to search for, but always using you as a guide, your wisdom, as we search for this truth and things that are yours. And Father, help us to take captive all the things around us in your name, that we can see it through that wisdom, that way that you want us to look at it. And Father, most of all, we thank you for the redemption that you give us through your Son. We thank you for that redemption where we can come together and see each other as your children, even with different views, even with different ways of seeing things, Father, that we are all your children, and that we see it through your Son's eyes in that redemptive story. Help us to heal. Help us to say things that are healing like you want us to do. And as always, Father, we say all of this in your Son's name.
Amen.